Hello, and welcome to another episode of Voice of the Disabled, produced by Adapt Productions of Chicago and broadcast from the studios of TAN TV on South Wood Street in Chicago. I'm Joel Margolis, your host, and with me today is Ms. Rachel Weisberg, who is the managing attorney for the organization Equip for Equality here in Chicago. Rachel, could you tell us broadly what is the mission of Equip for Equality?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me here today. Equip for Equality's mission is to advance the human and civil rights of people with disabilities in Illinois. We are a private, independent, nonprofit organization, and we provide free legal services to people with disabilities on issues related to their disability.
All right. Well, that sounds like a very admirable goal. It also takes in a lot of territory, okay? Now, in terms of mission, okay, I'm sure there's more than one component to providing legal services. Unless I'm misinformed, I believe that part of your mission is to act as a watchdog agency, okay? I heard that phrase used and saw it on your website. Watchdog can mean different things to different people. In your case, does watchdog mean primarily an observer of private sector employers for discrimination, or is it something broader than that?
You know, one of the things I really love about Equip for Equality is that we have a lot of different tools in our legal toolbox to try to accomplish different goals. And so being a watchdog agency is one of those tools. So when I think of watchdog, what I think about is we at Equip for Equality are called the Protection and Advocacy System for the state of Illinois. So every state has an organization just like ours that has some really unique powers given to us by Congress to actually go into places where people with disabilities live and work to monitor for abuse and neglect. So that's one way that we do, that I would say we are a watchdog. But sometimes what we'll do is in addition to receiving complaints from individuals, is that we'll do some affirmative or proactive initiatives to try to make sure that we are fighting and representing people with disabilities. So in the employment context, for example, we have a project where every summer we have a number of different legal interns. We ask our legal interns, go out and find employment applications. And so people will go to different stores or restaurants or look online and look at employment applications, and we'll review them to see if there's anything in that application that violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if we find something, we'll send a letter to the employer and say, hey, in our role as a protection and advocacy agency, we reviewed your employment application. We're concerned because you're asking a question about a medical condition or a disability that you're not allowed to do under the ADA, and then we'll ask them and urge them to make changes. And so that's one example of the type of watchdog type activities that we'll do.
Now, you mentioned just a moment ago the phrase federally mandated, okay, and that every state has an agency parallel to yours, okay? Was there a piece of federal legislation that required agencies like yours?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So yes, we are funded through a number of different statutes, federal statutes, and they all have the name protection and advocacy. So if my history is correct, the first one that was authorized by Congress is called PADD, P-A-D-D. Protection and Advocacy for People with Developmental Disabilities. And so we can use that funding to help us advocate for folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. And throughout the years, there's been more statutes like that. So we have another statute called PAMI, Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness.
A world of acronyms.
And of course, we're in the disability field, right? It's always the ABC soup. So those statutes give us both funding to provide free legal services to people, but they also give us that kind of really unique power or authority to do the work that we need to do.
So far you've been speaking of federal authorization, federal funding. Is the federal government your only source of financial support?
Well, Luckily, no. We've been creative over the years, and I think because we have an established history of doing a lot of effective work for folks, we've been able to secure some additional state private funding to help us advance our mission as well. But the federal funding is still kind of our core and what drives a lot of our work.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a moment ago reviewing employment applications, okay? Do you also receive complaints from private individuals alleging discrimination, okay? And in those situations, do you usually move to negotiate with the employer, or do you sometimes go directly to filing a lawsuit? What happens in those cases?
Okay, so as a lawyer, our favorite answer to every question is it depends. And so that's going to be my answer here too. And I'll just start by saying I really am passionate about the employment work that we do. And again, one of the reasons that I think we're so unique in the type of services that we provide is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that's really true for employment. So we run at Equip for Equality something called the Employment Rights Helpline. And through that helpline, we provide free advice, answer questions, provide behind-the-scenes counseling to anyone with a disability who's looking for a job, applying for a job, is an employee with a disability in Illinois. And so sometimes people will call us and they'll say, I had this situation at work. I've had this accommodation for 10 years. So, under the ADA, folks get reasonable accommodations for their disabilities.
The ADA being the Americans with Disabilities
Yes, exactly.
Act.
Thank you. The Americans with Disabilities Act. And so maybe there's been an employee with a disability that's worked effectively for 10 years at their job. And the reason that they've been so effective is that they are able to be a little bit flexible with their scheduling. Maybe instead of being at work every day at 8:30, days where they're having a little bit more, a little drowsy in the morning, a little more difficulty in the morning, exactly. Maybe they can start a little bit later. So someone calls us and says, I got a new supervisor. My new supervisor says, what is this? Everyone has to be here at 8:30 in the morning. All of a sudden, that person's in a really tough position. So as you said, there's lots of different approaches. That person could go straight to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and file a charge of discrimination and say, hey, I've had this reasonable accommodation for years. My supervisor came in. Our strategy is to say, maybe we'll get there, but let's start a little bit slower.
At a more modest level.
Yeah, and the reason why is that, I'm a lawyer. I think going to court's fun. There's definitely a time and a place for litigation to advance things. But for that person who just wants to go to their job the next day, sometimes it's just helping them write a letter and say, hey, supervisor, maybe you didn't know, but I'm a person with a disability. I have this accommodation. It's worked for me for 10 years. It's great. And sometimes us providing that behind-the-scenes help and kind of walking somebody through that process can solve the problem more easily, more quickly, and less adversarially.
Why use a sledgehammer when a tap of the finger might solve the problem?
Yeah, exactly. And and for some situations, that's the better solution. There are some situations where that's not going to work, and you have to go to court. Maybe that's because the two sides are just never going to agree, or because you've started kind of small and worked your way up, and you're at the point where it's court or nothing to advance somebody's rights.
Now, you've spoken about disabilities in the broad sense of the word. Does this mean that Equip for Equality represents not only those with physical disabilities, but also those who have mentally challenging conditions?
Yeah, so Equip for Equality is a cross-disability organization, so we represent folks with all different types of disabilities. And, again, one of those main laws that we use as one of our tools, the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, that law defines disability really broadly. And so it includes people who have physical disabilities, cognitive, sensory, mental health, kind of, it's a really broad statute, and we take that seriously, and we want to make sure that we are representing a whole diverse group of individuals.
And this would include a case in which I believe Equip for Equality either litigated on behalf of or negotiated on behalf of two data entry technicians who I believe were autistic, okay? What happened in that case? Without mentioning their names, can you tell us about that
Sure,
case?
and this is a case that I've been working on for years. This is a case that Equip for Equality brought on behalf of two young men who have autism. They, like many people with disabilities, were given the opportunity to learn a skill. They learned about how to do data entry, and they were really excellent at data entry. They were participating in a program that the state of Illinois ran, and they were doing data entry with a job coach who helped kind of keep them on task, and
They were doing the job.
they were doing the job. And the cool thing about data entry is that there's all these analytics. And so there was no dispute. You saw how many data entries, how much data they entered, and you could compare that to people that were permanent full-time employees.
So there was no question about their performance being substandard or anything like that.
Exactly.
But a problem arose nonetheless?
Yeah, so these two clients really, loved their job. They wanted to become full-time state employees doing similar job. But they ran into a problem, which is something that we see all the time, which is that an employer or a business or a government just has a system that's set up, and they're really strict about that system. They're really rigid. And of course, with disabilities, sometimes you need to make modifications or make accommodations. So for these two clients, to get a full-time state job, they would have had to take a very specific test, and then if they passed that test, they would have had to engage in a structured interview where they were asked a series of questions and had to answer those series of questions.
So it was not merely a written test, there was an oral interaction, and they were autistic.
Exactly. And, of course, a lot of folks who are autistic could get through that, but these two clients couldn't. One didn't communicate verbally at all, so would not have been able to participate in an interview. And so we had asked the state of Illinois to make a modification under the ADA to their hiring process to say, how else can we determine these two clients' qualifications? And the state, felt that they couldn't do that at the time. So this was an example where we tried to negotiate, we tried to talk with people, it just didn't work. And so we ended up filing a lawsuit in federal court in 2017. It's taken some time. We went through the whole legal process of discovery and filing motions. But last October, November of 2021, we reached a settlement agreement with the state of Illinois. We entered into what's called a memorandum of understanding, where we are working with the state to create new policies, practices, and trainings to make sure that folks who have autism or other developmental disabilities can demonstrate their abilities without having to go through this traditional test and interview process. And so we're not at the end, we're still finalizing those details, but we're hoping to be able to announce something soon about what the final results of that initiative will be.
And that sounds like a very nice accomplishment indeed.
I think the best thing is that, it's everyone's an individual and everyone has their own preferences. And so we represent two clients. One of them is really eager to work for the state. And so we're still looking for a job for him. And I'm just so hopeful that he'll be able to, find a position that he really loves and can show his skills.
Okay. Now that's a question of employment skills, and the like, okay? Do you also become involved in situations where a disabled individual has, at least based on initial information, suffered from some abuse or neglect?
We do, and so there is a part of our organization called the Independent Monitoring Unit. Those individuals who work on this team have a really great responsibility because they're the ones that use some of that statutory watchdog authority, where if they receive complaints or sometimes even proactively will go out and do monitoring for abuse and neglect.
This would be monitoring of residential facilities?
Yeah, it can be. I think a lot of the times it ends up being residential facilities. Technically, there are different types of places that folks can go, but I can give you an example of a recent case situation. So there is a residential facility called Northern Illinois Academy, NIA. And so NIA was a place where a lot of youth with disabilities lived, and we received a complaint about all sorts of allegations of abuse and neglect and using restraints and all sorts of just really horrific content. Well, our team went in, did some monitoring, spoke with the people who lived there, reviewed records, and ultimately filed a report with the state of Illinois. And as a result of that report, the state of Illinois closed down that facility and said this is just not a place where anyone should be living, and has been working to transition all of the youth into better, safer, more integrated settings.
And your charter of operation would enable you to check on cases of potential abuse and neglect in both government-sponsored and purely private sector settings?
Yeah, exactly.
And you have found abuse and neglect to occur sometimes in both?
I believe so, yeah. And I personally don't do, I'm not quite as knowledgeable about the abuse and neglect work as I am about the employment work, since that's my area of focus. But they do some, really extensive and important work.
Now, in the world of the disabled, in recent years, we've heard a great deal about people living out in the community rather than being institutionalized. But that in and of itself, an admirable goal, sometimes does create challenges. Does Equip for Equality become involved in any situations where the disabled are facing obstacles in living in the general community?
Yeah, a lot of different ways. And so we have 3 class action lawsuits where we helped people move from large institutions into the community. But to fast forward to your exact question about once people are in the community, people need appropriate supports, right? So we want to make sure that people have the supports necessary. So just a couple examples of things that we might do. There are programs that help provide home services, for example. So
Yes.
The Department of Rehabilitation Services has a home services program where you have to meet a certain level of need. It's called a DON score, determination of need.
Determination
And then if you get a certain DON score, then you get a certain number of service hours. And so we, at Equip for Equality, one of the things that we do is we help challenge some determinations that have been made by DOORS, the Department of Rehabilitation Services, to make sure that folks are getting the supports that they need to be able to live in the community and not have to go and live in institutions.
Aha, I see. Now, we've been speaking so far about a variety of ways in which Equip for Equality helps the disabled receive services and treatment to which they are entitled by law. Does Equip for Equality in any way become involved in the formulation of laws? Do you ever review pending legislation or things of that sort?
Yeah, we do all the time. And we actually have somebody whose job is she's the policy director. And so
that's the PD, the policy director.
Yes. That's what I'm going to start to call her. And she's, she works out of Springfield, and she is the one who will, talk with legislators. But we, of course, I think, again, one of the nice things about Equip for Equality is that because we're doing work on like a self-advocacy level and a litigation level and a legislative level, all of those initiatives inform one another. And so, we can go in and do some lobbying and say, this is what we're seeing based on, the 300 employment calls that we've gotten this year. Here's what we're seeing. And so I think what you're talking about creating new laws or amending laws or trying to solve problems proactively is a really important part of advocacy, and I'm really glad that that's something. It's not a huge part of what we do. It's again, it's
one of several.
It's one of several. It's one of several things that we do, but it's a really important part.
So there are cases then when Equip for Equality staff members might even testify before a state of Illinois legislative committee?
Yeah. And I know some of my supervisor, Barry Taylor, who's the vice president of civil rights, he has testified a number of different times about number of different things.
And speaking of Mr. Taylor, is he one of the people in this photograph here of the Equip for Equality staff?
He is.
Could you point him out?
Sure. So this is Barry Taylor.
And are you in this photo?
I am not in this photo. So this is a photo.
But we have you here in person.
I'm here in person, yes. So this is a photograph of a number of folks on our staff and actually their family members. We've got some kids here, so they're not on our staff. But this is a number number of individuals who were representing Equip for Equality at the 2022 Disability Pride Parade that took place in July. I unfortunately was on a family trip, so I had to miss it, but it's always one of our favorite events of the year to get the whole disability community together and, all kind of share our advocacy excitement.
And I'm sure you made a very strong showing, you as an organization.
I think, yeah, we usually have a nice showing there, and we always get wonderful T-shirts that we wear throughout the year to publicize Equip for Equality.
Well, it sounds like you do some fascinating work, which leads to the question, how did you, Rachel Weisberg, become involved in all of this? You apparently do not suffer any physical or mental disability yourself. How did you come to be in the position you're in? Where did all this start?
Yeah, I think the thing that we all know about disability, right, is that disability impacts everyone, I think to varying degrees and at varying times. I first became involved and interested in disability rights issues because my dad had multiple sclerosis, and he was diagnosed when I was about 3 years old and started using a wheelchair when I was about 6 years old. And so having a parent with a physical disability was, just a part of my life and something that, it very much normalized the disability experience for me, and it also really made me frustrated and mad when I was a kid and, we couldn't get in the front door at a restaurant. But of all the things that happened in my family's life, when my dad lost his job when I was in college, that was something that I just saw really, it was very difficult for him and by extension for our family. And so that's kind of what lit the fire in my belly about employment. But I will say, I have anxiety. It's not something that I don't think is as big a part of my life as my dad's physical disability was to him. But the more and more I learn about disability, it really impacts so many people in so many different ways.
So did you start doing some volunteer work with the disabled as a young person?
I think when I was a kid, I looked at it more of, like I always did, the MS readathons, we read books to raise money for the MS Society. And then once I was in college, I started looking at it more from a civil rights lens. And so in college, I volunteered and interned with the EEOC, which we talked about earlier, that federal agency that enforces the employment parts of the ADA. And then I just launched in after that. I just really launched into the disability rights
And
field.
where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Go Blue.
And you are from Michigan?
I am from Michigan.
Okay. And then from there, did you go directly on to law school?
I didn't. I had a professor in college that said, if you want to go to law school, you need to take a couple years off and make sure that you really want to go to law school. And so I did. I took a couple years off and I worked in the disability rights field in Washington, D.C. And for some people, thinking about it might deter them, but for me, it just solidified that this is exactly what I wanted to do. And so then I went back to law school a couple years out of college.
And did you go to law school also in Washington, D.C.?
I did my first year at American University, Washington College of Law, and then I transferred to Northwestern in Chicago.
And you finished up at Northwestern?
Exactly.
And then from there, you went directly to Equip for Equality?
I had a couple detours. I clerked for a federal judge. I worked in the management side of employment issues at a large law firm representing businesses called Sidley Austin.
Here in Chicago.
Here in Chicago, where I learned so much about being a good lawyer. And eventually I made myself back to Equip for Equality, where I've been for about 10 years.
Okay, and speaking of coming back to Equip for Equality, I believe we have a poster on your right that highlights Equip for Equality, if I might have it.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, and this very much tells us about the Equip for Equality purpose and mission.
Exactly. This was one of the posters that we made for our organization's 30th anniversary. We were founded in 1985, and so we had a big celebration for our 30th anniversary. And this, of course, is my favorite because it talks about it highlights a number of the different employment initiatives that we've done over the years.
And this was for the 30th anniversary.
Exactly.
Well, let me congratulate you on the 30th anniversary and hope that Equip for Equality enjoys at least another 30 years of such successful performance.
I hope so,
and
too.
Thank you for coming to be with me today.
My pleasure.
My guest today has been Ms. Rachel Weisberg, Managing Attorney with the not-for-profit organization Equip for Equality. I'm Joel Margolis, your host for Voice of the Disabled, brought to you by Adapt of Chicago Productions and broadcast from the studios of CAN TV on Southwood Street in Chicago. Thank you for joining us today, and please join us again soon at another episode of Voice of the Disabled. Goodbye only for now, because we hope to see you again. Thank you.